The floor gleamed like a mirror. Glass walls stretched so high they seemed to touch the clouds. Everything smelled faintly of leather and money. And then boots, heavy, mud-caked boots, each step leaving a faint trace of dried earth against the spotless tile. People noticed. They always do. The man wearing them didn't dress for this kind of place. Faded denim, sun-worn flannel, a battered cap that had seen more summers than some of the young salesmen gliding across the floor. He paused just inside the entrance, scanning the polished showroom where millions of dollars worth of jets sat like sleeping beasts. A salesman spotted him instantly. Tall, slick hair, a practiced smile that could close deals from 50 feet away. But this smile was different. It was the kind you give someone you've already decided isn't worth your time. He started walking over, straightening his tie as if he might need to brace himself for a conversation about tractors maybe. The farmer's eyes didn't wander. They moved with intent, sweeping over the wings, the engines, the gleaming fuselages. He wasn't here to gawk. He was sizing them up, the way a man checks a field before deciding where to plant. "Can I help you?" The salesman's tone was polite enough, but the pause before help made it clear he was already wondering how to get rid of him. The farmer didn't flinch. "I'm here to buy a jet." It wasn't loud. It wasn't said for effect. Just a fact laid plainly on the table. The salesman blinked, and the smirk deepened, like he'd just been handed the setup for a joke. He glanced around, making sure a few of his colleagues were within earshot, before replying, "Of course you are. And what kind of budget are we talking?" The farmer's face stayed unreadable. "Depends on what you've got." From across the room, a couple of other customers had turned to look. There's a certain kind of quiet in moments like this. The kind where people are pretending not to listen. The farmer knew it well. He'd heard it in bank offices, at auctions, on the other side of gas station counters. The salesman's gaze dropped briefly to the boots again, the cracked leather, the dried mud, then back up with a thin smile. "Well, let's start small." But the farmer didn't move toward the smaller models. He stepped past the salesman, toward the largest jet in the showroom, the one with custom interiors and a range meant for crossing oceans. His hand rested lightly on the gleaming curve of the fuselage. He wasn't imagining, he was inspecting. Behind him, the salesman's smirk faltered. Just for a second. The farmer caught it in the reflection of the polished metal, and he allowed himself the smallest smile. He hadn't come here to dream. He'd come here to buy. The salesman's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile you give when you think you already know the ending. "Well," he said, drawing out the word as though he were humoring a child. "You're looking at our top-tier model here. Very exclusive, not something we usually discuss without a serious buyer." The farmer tilted his head, just slightly. "Then let's discuss it." The words were calm, even, but they hung there in the space between them, heavier than they should have been. The salesman gave a quick, breathy laugh. Not a friendly one. The kind that bounces off polished walls and carries further than you think. A few feet away, another salesman glanced over, raising an eyebrow. A pair of customers by the coffee bar looked up too, their expressions hovering between curiosity and amusement.
"You mean this one?"
The salesman gestured toward the gleaming jet as though the very idea were absurd. Let's just say it's a little out of most people's price range." The farmer didn't answer right away. His eyes moved slowly along the fuselage, taking in every inch. He stepped closer, peering at the engine intake like a man who knew what he was looking at. "You said it had a range of over 6,000 nautical miles?" His voice was low, steady. The salesman blinked. Yes. Yes, that's right. And service intervals." There was a pause. The salesman shifted his weight. "Every 300 hours of flight. But look, maybe we should." Another chuckle, louder this time, broke from his throat. It wasn't just about the question anymore. It was about the boots, the jacket, the dirt under the fingernails. Across the room, the customers by the coffee bar were whispering now. One of them smirked. The other pulled out a phone, not yet recording, just ready. The farmer's gaze stayed on the jet. His hands were in his pockets, his posture loose, but there was a stillness in him that didn't match the casual stance. He'd seen this before. Men who thought they could measure worth in fabric and polish. Men who believed silence meant surrender. "Tell me about the avionics package," the farmer said at last. The salesman's smile faltered for the briefest second before snapping back into place. "Full glass cockpit, triple redundant systems, synthetic vision. But again, these are things. Another laugh. Short. Sharp. The kind meant to make sure everyone nearby knew the punchline was standing in front of them. The farmer didn't move. Didn't rise to it. His eyes locked on the salesman's for the first time, steady and unblinking. And in that silence, there was something that made the other man shift his feet. The farmer was in no hurry. Some storms don't need thunder to be dangerous. From the far side of the showroom, a glass-walled office overlooked the floor like a watchtower. Inside, the salesman leaned against the desk of another colleague. Voice pitched low enough to seem private, but not so low it couldn't leak through the glass. "Time waster," he muttered. "Doesn't belong here. Probably just wants to take pictures to impress his buddies." The colleague gave a thin, knowing smile, the kind that travels well in places like this. The farmer didn't need to see their lips move. The sound carried just enough for him to catch every word. He stayed where he was, standing near a wall of framed photographs, sleek jets slicing through blue skies, champagne flutes balanced on leather armrests, deals sealed with toothy smiles. The people in those pictures didn't look like him. Not a single one. In their eyes, he knew, a man like him was built for hauling grain, repairing fences, working sunup to sundown for modest pay. Not for walking into a marble-floored showroom and negotiating millions. Certainly not for touching the crown jewel of their inventory. His thumb brushed the brim of his cap. He kept his eyes fixed on a photo of a jet lifting off into a sunrise. He thought about how many sunrises he'd worked through. Hands numb. Eyes burning from wind and dust. They didn't know about the storms. The ones that drowned half a season's yield. The ones that left frost over tender crops in May. They didn't know about the years of watching markets like a hawk, making decisions in minutes that meant survival or ruin. They didn't know he'd sat across from bankers who said maybe next year until there was no next year left, that he'd signed away land his family had worked for generations. They didn't know about the day he got it back. The words from the corner office floated out again, a chuckle this time. The farmer didn't turn his head. Instead, he studied the polished curve of another jet in the photos. One he could have bought 5 years ago if he'd wanted to. There's a patience you learn from planting seeds you won't see sprout for months. A patience that doesn't waver when someone decides your worth in a glance. He let their voices fade into the background hum of the showroom. His hands stayed loose at his sides, his face unreadable. In their world, money spoke in designer suits and luxury watches. In his, it spoke in acres, in yields, in the quiet stacking of seasons until they formed something unshakable. They saw mud on his boots. He saw the jet he'd be flying within weeks. He'd been born into soil. The kind that clings to your skin and stains your nails no matter how hard you scrub. His earliest memories were of chasing chickens between weathered barns. Of his father's hands, thick, strong, always smelling faintly of diesel and earth. They were never rich, but the land was theirs. Until it wasn't. When he was 19, a drought hit harder than anything in living memory. Crops failed, bills piled high. The bank called in loans they knew couldn't be repaid. One by one, neighbors sold off parcels just to keep the lights on. When it was his family's turn, the buyers came in suits and left with deeds. He watched his father hand over the keys to the barn like he was surrendering a piece of his own chest. For a while the farmer worked anywhere that paid. Construction, trucking, odd jobs that kept him on the road and away from the pain of seeing their old fields worked by someone else. But the pull of the land never left. He started small. Leased 20 acres no one wanted, soil so poor most thought it useless. He studied at night, crop science, export regulations, market trends. While others laughed, he experimented with niche organic grains, crops that overseas buyers paid premiums for if you could meet the quality. He lived lean. Every dollar went back into the dirt, irrigation systems, soil regeneration, specialized equipment. Year after year, the yields grew. By the 5th season, he was supplying high-end restaurants in 3 countries. By the 8th, he had contracts with major distributors who didn't care what boots he wore as long as his shipments were flawless. He bought back the family land in cash. Quietly. No announcements, just a handshake with the man who'd been working it, and a walk through the barn, touching every beam like greeting an old friend. But he didn't stop. He expanded, diversified, built storage facilities, invested in cold chain logistics. His name didn't appear on flashy magazines, but in the right trade circles, he was a legend. The man who could get a shipment from field to foreign table faster than anyone. And he kept his life simple. Old truck. Same farmhouse. Boots that had seen 1,000 sunrise. That was his shield. The quiet life. The underestimation. People showed you their real selves when they thought you had nothing to bargain with. Now, standing in a jet showroom surrounded by polished steel and people who thought they knew the measure of him, he was exactly where he wanted to be. They saw dirt on his hands. He knew it was gold. The salesman's smile was fixed in place, but his eyes carried that look of someone going through the motions. He stood beside the gleaming jet, one hand resting lightly on its polished skin, the other gesturing with a rehearsed flourish. "This here is our flagship," he said, drawing out each word as if savoring a private joke. "Full luxury interior, top-of-the-line materials, entertainment systems you'd expect on a flying penthouse." He glanced over his shoulder toward the corner office, catching the eye of his colleague. The faintest smirk passed between them. The farmer followed the salesman's hand as he pointed out the leather seating, the custom cabinetry, the gold-trimmed fixtures. The words were smooth, but the tone carried an edge, the kind that says the story isn't really for you, it's for the audience watching. "Engines?" the farmer asked. The salesman hesitated just half a beat before answering. "Twin turbofans. Powerful enough. Make and model." A flicker crossed the salesman's face. "Pratt & Whitney PW3. The farmer nodded once, eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the engine housing. "Thrust output, around 6,000 pounds each. Range with full payload?" The salesman straightened a little, his patter thrown off. 6,200 nautical miles. "And your maintenance intervals?" That stopped him, not because he didn't know, but because most people who wandered in for a look never asked. "Every 300 hours, he said, voice quieter now. The farmer stepped into the cabin without waiting for an invitation. He moved through it slowly, not touching much, just looking, really looking. His gaze swept over the cockpit, pausing on the instrument panels. "Garmin or Collins?" he asked. The salesman cleared his throat. "Collins Proline Fusion." The farmer nodded again, as though filing the answer away in some mental ledger. He crouched to check the seat rails, glanced at the overhead bins, then turned back toward the salesman. "What's your delivery timeline if I order today?" There was no smile this time, no wink toward the corner office. The salesman's expression had shifted, the edges of his confidence starting to fray. "It would depend on the customization package," he said carefully. "And if I want it exactly as displayed." The question hung there, heavier than it should have been. The salesman's mouth opened, closed. 4 months, he said finally. The farmer straightened, meeting his eyes for the first time in minutes. "Put together your best offer. Today." The words were plain, no drama. But the tone, steady, certain, left no space for dismissal. Something flickered behind the salesman's eyes, a realization creeping in slow. This wasn't a man here to play dress-up in someone else's world. This was a man who could buy the whole room if he felt like it. The salesman slid into the chair behind his desk, still wearing that careful, almost patronizing smile. "All right," he said, "let's talk numbers." His tone suggested this was the point where the farmer would start making excuses. The farmer reached into his jacket pocket without a word. From it he drew a black titanium credit card, its surface catching the light with a dull, understated sheen. No gold edges, no flashy logos. Just weight, the kind that clinks when it lands. He set it down on the polished desk. The sound was small, but it carried. The salesman blinked, the corners of his mouth twitching into a nervous chuckle. "You'll need financing," he said, almost as a reflex, like a line he'd repeated to countless dreamers before. "Run it," the farmer said. His voice was even, his gaze steady. "For the deposit. For the full deposit," the farmer replied, leaning back slightly in the chair. The salesman hesitated, the faint crease between his brows deepening. "Sir, we're talking about—" "I know what we're talking about," the farmer interrupted. Something in the tone made the salesman pick up the card. He turned toward the machine, sliding it through with a deliberate slowness, as if giving the farmer time to reconsider. The screen lit up, processing. A low beep filled the space. "Approved." The confirmation tone was sharp and unmistakable. The salesman froze. His shoulders stiffened. A faint flush crept up his neck. He looked at the screen again, then back at the farmer, then down at the card in his hand. The conversation in the showroom shifted. The low murmur of voices quieted, replaced by an almost tangible stillness. People who had been glancing casually now stared openly. Across the room, one of the other salesmen put down his coffee mid-sip. The receptionist's fingers hovered over her keyboard. The farmer didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply took the card back, slipped it into his pocket and said, "Now where do I sign?" The salesman cleared his throat, fumbling for the paperwork. His voice had lost its condescension. It was careful now, deliberate. Every word weighed before it left his mouth. In that silence, the balance of the room had shifted. No raised voices. No scene, just a quiet, undeniable reminder. The measure of a man isn't in the mud on his boots. Near the far wall, a young woman sat on a low leather bench, scrolling through her phone. She was waiting for her father's flight to land, half listening to the hum of the showroom. When she first heard the salesman laugh earlier, she'd looked up. The sound had that sharp, public edge, the kind meant to draw others in. She'd seen the man in the boots, the way he stood without flinching. On instinct, she tapped her phone's camera and hit record. Through the screen, she caught it all. The salesman's smirk, the way he gestured like the whole exchange was for show, the questions the farmer asked that seemed to unsettle him. And then came the card. She zoomed in as the farmer placed it on the desk. No hesitation, no theatrics. Just a simple motion, like this was an everyday thing. She heard the salesman's nervous laugh, the farmer's calm reply, the machine's beep. Approved. Her camera caught the exact moment the salesman's face changed. The shift from superiority to something closer to disbelief. The ripple it caused. The receptionist looking up. The other salesman freezing mid-step. The hush settling over the room. The farmer didn't notice her, or maybe he did and didn't care. He was busy signing the paperwork, his posture relaxed, his movements unhurried. When it was over, she stopped recording. She replayed the clip once, then again. The contrast was undeniable, the laugh at the start, the silence at the end. She opened her social media app, her fingers hovering for a second. Then she typed the caption without overthinking, "Never judge a man by his boots." She hit post. The first few likes came within minutes, then comments. Someone shared it. Then someone else. The numbers started climbing. Hundreds. Then thousands. People tagged friends, adding their own stories of being underestimated. Others expressed outrage at the salesman's tone. Within an hour, it had passed 50,000 views. By the time her father's flight landed, the clip was on 2 major meme pages. By nightfall, it was trending in 3 countries. In the comments, people weren't just talking about the farmer. They were talking about every time they'd been sized up and dismissed in a glance. Every time someone had decided they didn't belong. And while the showroom staff tried to go about business as usual, the internet was already writing a story none of them could control. The algorithm of outrage. By midnight, the post had taken on a life of its own. The comments weren't just about the jet anymore. They were about years of small humiliations. The quick glances that measured worth in seconds. The quiet sting of being laughed at in public. One man wrote, "I walked into a car dealership in work clothes. After a 14-hour shift. They wouldn't even unlock the door to a model I wanted. Paid cash somewhere else the next day." A woman replied, "Same thing happened when I tried to buy a wedding dress after work. Dirt under my nails. They said they were fully booked." The store was empty. Anger swelled in thread after thread. And in between the outrage, there was admiration for the farmer's stillness, for the way he didn't bite, didn't match mockery with mockery. "This," one comment read, "is how you handle disrespect with proof, not noise." By morning, the clip had crossed 3 million views. News blogs grabbed it first, calling it the jet showroom moment that broke the internet. Then local TV stations picked it up. By afternoon, national outlets were running with it. The framing was clear. This wasn't just a quirky story about a rich farmer. It was about classism. About the casual bias in industries built to sell dreams but only to certain-looking dreamers. Anchors repeated the same phrase, "Never judge a man by his boots," as if it were the story's official title. The showroom's name was unavoidable. Hashtags carried it. Headlines printed it. On Twitter, a trending tag read, "And boots in the showroom." The dealership's PR team scrambled. They posted a bland statement about valuing all customers, but it was too late. Screenshots of staff smirking in the background of the video were already circulating. People were finding old reviews, digging up similar complaints. By day's end, the company's own website had been swamped with messages demanding an apology. Not just to the farmer but to anyone treated the same way. And in the middle of it all, the farmer wasn't online defending himself. He wasn't giving interviews, he was still in that same showroom. Still in the negotiation room, letting the storm outside build to hurricane strength. Because he knew something they didn't. Sometimes you don't have to fight the battle yourself. Sometimes the crowd does it for you. The phone rang in the corner office. A sharp, insistent sound that cut through the muted tension of the showroom. The salesman's colleague answered. But it was clear within seconds who was on the line. The regional director. The voice on the other end was clipped. Furious. What happened in there? Why is our name on every social media feed in the country? The salesman was summoned into the office. He straightened his tie, tried to compose himself, but his face was pale. He launched into the story before he was asked how it was all a misunderstanding, how he was simply doing his job. I didn't mean anything by it, he said, defensive now. It's just people like that don't usually... He stopped himself, realizing too late that even in private, the words didn't sound good. The director didn't soften. Fix it. Now. This is going all the way up. Meanwhile, in the negotiation room, the farmer sat alone at the table. He could hear muffled voices from the office, the strained urgency, the half-formed excuses. His hands were folded loosely in front of him, his posture calm. When the salesman returned, his smile was gone entirely. Sir, there seems to be a bit of noise online about what happened earlier, he began carefully. The farmer looked at him without blinking. I'm aware. We'd like to move forward with your purchase quickly, of course, but I'd like to speak to your CEO, the farmer said, cutting through the salesman's measured tone. The salesman blinked. Sir, the CEO doesn't usually... I'm not asking because I want to talk about the jet, the farmer said, voice steady. I'm asking because this isn't just about me. And your CEO needs to hear that from my mouth, not yours. The salesman hesitated, glancing toward the office where the director was still on the line. I can see if he's available. Good, the farmer said. Do that. It wasn't ego in his voice. It wasn't the swagger of a man looking for a public apology. It was something colder, sharper. The tone of someone who had decided the lesson would be bigger than the slight. In the corner of the showroom, the young woman with the phone was still there, her screen lighting up every few seconds with another notification. The storm outside the glass walls was getting louder, and the salesman knew it. He also knew there was no way to stop it now. The laptop was placed in the center of the negotiation table. A moment later, the CEO's face appeared on the screen. Crisp suit, sharp jawline, the polished confidence of a man used to controlling the conversation. I'm told you've had an unusual experience with our staff. The CEO began. The farmer nodded once. That's one way to put it. He spoke plainly, without heat. He described the look he'd been given when he walked in, the chuckle at his request for details, the words whispered in the corner office. He talked about the tone, not just the words, and how it was the kind he'd heard all his life from people who thought they knew his place. This isn't about one man's bad manners, the farmer said. It's about a culture that assumes worth is worn on the outside. The CEO's expression didn't change much, but there was a flicker. The kind that comes when someone realizes this might not be a quick conversation. The farmer leaned forward slightly. I'm not here for an apology. I'm not interested in free perks or a discount. I'll finish the purchase today, if you agree to implement staff training on class and appearance bias in every one of your locations. Permanently. The CEO tilted his head, as if weighing whether he'd heard correctly. You're making this a condition of sale. I am. And if we don't, the farmer's voice didn't shift in volume, but the weight of it settled into the air. Then you don't get the sale, and you keep the problem. The CEO leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. That's a significant request, he said slowly. There are cost implications. And the optics. The salesman, seated off to the side, shifted in his chair, his eyes darting between the two men. The farmer cut in gently. The optics are already set. You're trending worldwide, and not because of your jets. The CEO's mouth tightened. You're asking us to change company policy based on a single incident. The farmer shook his head. No. I'm asking you to recognize that this single incident is one of many. Mine just happened to be caught on camera. The salesman cleared his throat. Sir, maybe we... The farmer's gaze flicked to him. Do you know how many people have seen that video now? The CEO hesitated. Over 5 million, the farmer said, and 3 national news networks have already run the story. By tomorrow it'll be more. This isn't just optics. This is reputation survival. Silence settled for a beat. The hum of the showroom beyond the glass felt suddenly louder. The CEO's eyes narrowed, but not in anger, in calculation. The numbers were working their way through his head, the way market forecasts do before a big decision. Finally, he said, "Let me speak with my board." The farmer nodded. "I'll wait." The CEO reappeared on the laptop screen. His expression measured but no longer dismissive. "We'll implement the training," he said. "All locations. Effective immediately." The farmer simply nodded. No smile. No gloating. "Good," he replied. "Then let's finish the sale." The salesman returned to the table with a stack of paperwork, his movement stiff. The pages slid across the polished surface toward the farmer. But before touching the pen, the farmer looked up. "One more thing." The salesman froze. The CEO raised an eyebrow. "When the handover happens," the farmer said, "I want cameras rolling, and I want you to make a public statement about the new policy. Not buried in a press release. Not a side note, front and center." "That's unusual," the CEO said. "It's necessary," the farmer answered. "People need to see what's changing. Otherwise it's just words on paper." The CEO studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Agreed." The salesman's hand trembled as he passed the pen. The ink scratched softly across the contract, each stroke binding the agreement, the jet, the policy, the public acknowledgement. When the last page was signed, the farmer set the pen down gently, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. In the corner of the showroom, the young woman with the phone was still there, her screen lighting up again and again with fresh notifications. Somewhere out there, millions of strangers were waiting to see what happened next. The farmer stood, buttoned his jacket and offered his hand to the salesman. It was a gesture of closure, but the salesman's grip was tentative, his eyes fixed on the signed papers like they might burn him. "See you at the handover," the farmer said, and walked out without looking back. 1 week later, a small stage was set up in front of the flagship showroom. Cameras lined the space, tripods bristling, microphones clustered like curious birds. The CEO stepped to the podium first, his voice steady but careful. "Today we're announcing new staff training protocols across all our dealerships, designed to eliminate class and appearance bias from every customer interaction. This comes from valuable feedback from one of our most respected customers." He gestured to his right. The farmer stepped forward. Boots polished but still boots, his jacket plain, his expression calm. He didn't wave. He didn't smile for the camera. "I'm not here for credit," he said quietly. "I'm here to make sure the next person who walks into a place like this in overalls and work boots and whatever they wear to earn their living is treated like their money is worth the same as anyone else's." There was a pause. The cameras clicked. Somewhere in the crowd, someone murmured, "That's him." The farmer gave a single nod and stepped back. It wasn't about the spotlight. It was about making sure the light stayed on the change. The press conference had barely ended before the internet turned its attention elsewhere. Not away from the story, but deeper into it. Investigative journalists began combing through the dealership chain's past. It started with old Yelp reviews and Google comments buried under years of routine praise. There were scattered complaints, customers who said they'd been ignored, rushed out, or treated like they couldn't possibly afford a purchase. Most were brushed off at the time, dismissed as misunderstanding. Now, in the shadow of the viral clip, those reviews read differently. Former employees began reaching out to reporters. Some spoke on record, others anonymously, but their stories lined up. There had been informal profiling, quiet decisions about who got immediate service and who was left to browse alone. One woman who had worked at the flagship location for 6 years admitted she'd been instructed, more than once, to focus on the real buyers. The unspoken criteria: clothes, accessories, posture, and sometimes skin color. A former sales manager described being reprimanded for spending too much time with a man in oil-stained coveralls. "He paid cash for a high-end model," the manager said. "But they still told me I should have screened better." The deeper journalists dug, the more the pattern emerged. It wasn't just one salesman, one day, one misjudgment. It was a culture. Subtle, rarely documented, but reinforced by winks, chuckles, and the occasional whispered warning about time wasters. Social media amplified each new revelation. Screenshots of past customer complaints were shared alongside the viral video, creating a timeline of bias that stretched back years. The company's PR department issued another statement, this one acknowledging the deeply troubling reports and promising a full review. But to the public, it sounded less like leadership and more like damage control. For the farmer, it confirmed what he'd already known. His story was never just his. It was a door kicked open, letting in light on something that had been happening quietly for far too long. And now, the light wasn't going out. In the weeks after the press conference, the farmer's phone rang more than it ever had in his life. Reporters wanted interviews. Podcasters wanted the man in the boots on their shows. Advocacy groups asked him to speak at events. At first, he said no to most of them. He hadn't stepped into that showroom to become a symbol. But the more he watched the coverage, the more he realized the moment had given him something rare. A microphone, loud enough to reach people who usually never listen. So, when a local radio station invited him to talk about the incident, he agreed. And instead of retelling the viral story, he talked about the struggles nobody was filming. The rural towns where the nearest bank was 50 miles away. The farmers forced into predatory loans with interest rates designed to break them. The young people who wanted to farm but couldn't afford the land or the machinery to start. This isn't just about luxury showrooms, he told the host. It's about the quiet ways people get told they're worth less, and how that robs communities of their future. The interview struck a chord. More invitations followed, and this time he chose them carefully. Each platform became a chance to widen the conversation, to talk about how institutions, banks, dealerships, even equipment suppliers often preyed on those who didn't look like they had options. He spoke with the same calm he'd shown in the showroom, never raising his voice, never turning his message into a rant. It made people listen. Then he went further. Using his own money, he announced a scholarship program for young farmers. Not just for tuition but for equipment, seed and the down payments that kept so many from getting started. He set it up quietly at first, but when a reporter found out, the story went national. Applications poured in from across the country. Sons and daughters of farmers who'd lost their land, veterans looking to start sustainable farms, teenagers who'd grown up in 4-H and FFA programs, but had no financial path forward. The farmer read every application himself. He didn't just want to hand out checks, he wanted to invest in people who would keep the soil alive for the next generation. Meanwhile, he began meeting with state legislators, pushing for policies that would protect agricultural entrepreneurs from discrimination, whether from lenders, insurers, or buyers. He argued for transparency in loan approvals, for stricter oversight of rural banking practices, and for grants that didn't penalize applicants for the wrong appearance. In every meeting he wore the same boots, not as a gimmick, but as a reminder, to himself and to everyone across the table, that the people they were talking about weren't an abstraction. They were real, they were capable, and they were worth betting on. The jet might have been the purchase. But this was the fight. The email arrived on a Monday morning. It was short, formal, and cold. Effective immediately, he was suspended pending investigation. No clients, no commissions, no stepping foot inside the showroom. At first he was furious. Not at himself, at them, at the social media mob, at the news anchors who replayed the clip with knowing smirks, at the comments calling him arrogant, condescending, or worse. He told anyone who would listen that this was just cancel culture. That one bad moment had erased years of good sales. That people didn't understand how luxury industries worked. How you had to qualify customers before wasting hours on someone who couldn't buy. But the days stretched on, and the noise online didn't fade. His inbox filled with messages, many from strangers who didn't bother with pleasantries. Some were angry, some sarcastic, some vicious. And then, slowly, different kinds of messages began arriving. One from a mechanic in Texas, who wrote about walking into a motorcycle dealership in coveralls and being told the model he wanted was probably out of his league. Another from a woman in Maine, who had been saving for years to buy her dream boat, only to have the salesman speak exclusively to her husband, even after she said she was the buyer. A man from Ohio described how a jeweler refused to unlock a case for him because his work shirt was stained with grease from his job. They weren't attacking him. They were telling him what it felt like to be dismissed in an instant. And as he read, he noticed something he hadn't expected. The story sounded exactly like what he'd done. He began replaying that day in his head, the boots, the cap, the quiet confidence he'd mistaken for bluff. The way he'd laughed, not just once, but twice. Loud enough for others to hear. It wasn't just the farmer he'd embarrassed. It was everyone watching. By the end of the week, the defensiveness had started to fade. He realized he'd been measuring people the same shallow way he accused outsiders of measuring success. The worst part wasn't the suspension. It was knowing that the internet would move on. But the video would still be there. A permanent record of a moment when he'd shown the smallest version of himself. For the first time, he didn't just want the story to go away. He wanted to be different when it did. In boardrooms across the country, the video of the farmer and the salesman played on loop. Not as entertainment, as a warning. Luxury dealerships in other cities began holding quiet meetings with their staff. The message was clear. This could happen here. One careless laugh, one moment of arrogance, and the world could be watching before the customer even left the building. Some dealers brought in consultants to review customer service protocols. Others issued internal memos reminding employees that appearance is not a qualifier for interest. Training modules were updated. Role-playing exercises were introduced, pairing sales staff with actors dressed in everything from work boots to formal wear. It wasn't just fear of public shaming driving the change. Industry leaders started running the numbers. A single viral incident could cost millions, not just in lost sales but in reputation, investor confidence, and brand partnerships. Trade publications picked up the trend. One headline read, "The cost of bias in the luxury market." Another, "From showroom to shakedown, how one farmer changed the rules." Articles dissected the farmer's case, quoting marketing experts who called it a textbook example of reputation risk. Analysts pointed out that customers with non-traditional appearances were often high-value buyers. Entrepreneurs, tech founders, investors, who preferred to avoid flashy displays. Turning them away wasn't just wrong, it was bad business. Some dealerships used the farmer's story as part of their onboarding for new hires, showing the clip before explaining company values. Others printed the phrase "never judge a man by his boots" on internal posters. The ripple even reached beyond jets and cars. High-end real estate agencies, luxury watch retailers, and private clubs began reviewing how their frontline staff interacted with walk-ins. Bias training budgets quietly increased. And through it all, the farmer stayed silent on the changes. He didn't comment publicly. He didn't claim credit. But in certain circles, people knew. This shift, subtle as it was, started because one man refused to let a slight slide. Not with anger, not with shouting, with proof, patience, and a demand that went further than himself. The ripple wasn't over. It was only beginning. The sound came long before the sight. A low, steady hum that grew into a deep-throated roar over the rolling fields. People had been gathering at the small rural airstrip since sunrise. Pickup trucks lined the gravel road. Kids sat on shoulders. Elders in folding chairs leaned forward, shielding their eyes from the glare. They weren't here for a show. They were here for a moment. And then, over the tree line, it appeared. Sleek. Silver. The afternoon sun caught its wings, throwing shards of light across the open sky. The jet circled once, dipping its nose in a graceful arc before lining up with the narrow strip of asphalt. Engines thundered. Landing gear kissed the ground, and the machine rolled to a smooth stop at the far end. The crowd erupted, not in wild cheers but in the kind of applause reserved for something personal, something shared. The farmer stepped down from the cab of his truck and walked toward it, boots crunching against the gravel. He wore the same cap, the same jacket, the same steady expression he'd had in the showroom weeks earlier. But here, he wasn't just a customer. He was theirs. Kids ran ahead, pointing at the tail number stenciled in bold letters. Old neighbors clapped him on the back as he passed. Some shook his hand. Others simply nodded, their eyes saying what words couldn't. For them, the jet wasn't a trophy. It was proof that a man from these fields, with calloused hands and soil under his nails, could walk into the most polished of rooms and leave with the keys to something that crossed oceans. The pilot stepped out and handed over the logbook. The farmer accepted it without ceremony, tucking it under his arm as if it were no different than the ledger he kept for his crops. Someone called out, "Gonna take us for a ride?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. The farmer smiled faintly. "One at a time," he said. But beneath the jokes, the air carried something heavier. A shared pride. A quiet defiance against the idea that worth was written on a person's clothes, their address, their accent. He walked the length of the jet, running his hand along the smooth metal. Cameras flashed, phones recorded. Somewhere the video would make its way online, and strangers would argue about wealth and humility. Here, none of that mattered. Here, it was about the kid leaning against the fence line, seeing not just a jet, but the path it represented. It was about the neighbors remembering the day the bank took the family land, and the day he got it back. It was about standing equal in any room, boots and all. The bill started as a single sheet of paper on a cluttered desk in the state capitol. Its sponsor, a legislator from a rural district, had been following the farmer's story since the day it hit the news. She'd watched the viral clip more than once, not for the entertainment value but for what it revealed. The quick dismissal, the public laughter, the shift in tone when the truth became undeniable. This, she told her aides, tapping the screen, isn't just about one man, it's about a habit, and habits can be changed. Her proposal was straightforward. Require every licensed luxury dealership in the state, whether they sold cars, yachts or jets, to provide regular anti-bias training for all staff. Not just once at hiring, but annually. The focus. Class and appearance bias, the very assumptions that had turned a routine purchase into a national talking point. When the bill was introduced, it drew mixed reactions. Some industry voices called it unnecessary regulation. Others argued it was long overdue. But the public pressure was relentless. Constituents flooded lawmakers' inboxes with their own stories of being dismissed, ignored or patronized because they didn't look the part. The farmer's name came up often in committee hearings. He didn't testify, he didn't need to. The clip had already said more than any speech could, but he did meet privately with several legislators, explaining calmly how bias wasn't just offensive, it was bad for business, bad for communities, bad for trust. The bill moved faster than most expected. In the final vote, support came from both sides of the aisle. It wasn't framed as a culture war. It was framed as good customer service, as fairness, as protecting the dignity of anyone who walked into a showroom. When it passed, the governor signed it in front of a small crowd. There were no big ceremonies, no viral speeches, just the quiet formality of law being made. The legislator who had written it sent the farmer a copy of the signed bill. Attached was a note in neat handwriting. From one quiet fighter to another, thank you for starting this. It was the first time a single viral moment had rippled all the way into the state code, and it wouldn't be the last. Months later, the farmer stepped into another luxury showroom. Different city, different staff, same polished floors and gleaming machines. This time, heads turned for a different reason. He was greeted immediately, not with the guarded politeness of someone making assumptions, but with genuine welcome. A salesman shook his hand firmly, asked what he was interested in, and listened. Really listened. He walked the floor without anyone shadowing him with suspicion. No chuckles, no sidelong glances, just respect. He knew the internet had already moved on to its next outrage, its next hero. His name would fade from trending lists, the clip buried under countless others. And that was fine, because the work wasn't about being remembered. It was about the changes that would keep happening long after the story stopped being told. About the young buyers who would walk into places like this and find doors opening instead of closing. About the staff who would think twice before deciding who was worth their time. He paused beside a display model, running his hand along the smooth curve of the paint. Somewhere, he imagined, another farmer was being treated right in a showroom because of what had happened here months ago. He smiled. Small, private, knowing. Power, he'd learned, isn't loud. It doesn't need to announce itself. It's knowing exactly who you are and acting from